I had spent years holding back my voice, bending to the quiet rules of their expectations, swallowing the sharp edges of every glance, every dismissive word. My name is Ottilie Crane, and I had learned early how to carry their indifference like a weight across my shoulders. Every sacrifice, every silent compromise, was met with the same cold glance, the same unspoken judgment. I had believed patience could make them see me, that endurance might earn a place beside them. But tonight, staring at the last undeniable betrayal, I realized I had been wrong. The silence I tolerated for so long was no longer mine to give. I would not step aside. I would not wait for permission. Something had shifted inside me, and for the first time, I understood that the order they had imposed was about to unravel, and they had no idea it was coming. The room was quiet in a way that felt heavy, every whisper bouncing off the polished floors and muted walls. I stepped inside, noticing Eleanor settled at the center, posture rigid, eyes scanning every corner, as though she owned not just the space, but everyone in it. The weight of the ceremony pressed down differently on me than on anyone else. There was no need for words to tell me the distance between us. The ease with which she commanded the room made my own presence feel almost invisible. A small envelope rested in my hand, handed over by the estate attorney with a perfunctory nod. Inside, a coin from my father's military days, and a photo of him beside a jet gleaming under the sun. My chest tightened. It was both a reminder of what he valued and a quiet accusation of what I had never received. Recognition in cash or land had been withheld, yet here was this emblem of pride, weighty in my palm, telling me silently what he saw in me, even if the world, or my family, refused to. Eleanor's fingers tapped a mouse, scrolling through documents, moving assets with deliberate precision. Her gaze never met mine. The subtlety stung. Every deliberate click, every adjustment of the papers whispered control and calculation. I felt the familiar ache of being sidelined, measured, and minimized, a phantom burden I had carried for years without complaint. Around us, soft murmurs of condolences and low voices only underscored the isolation. Empty chairs loomed like specters between the family members, who should have been close. I clenched the coin, grounding myself in its weight. This was more than grief. It was recognition of the silent battles fought in every glance, every act of dismissal. And in that moment, I understood clearly that Eleanor's games were deliberate, her strategy carefully mapped to undermine me, and that the quiet order she maintained over this room was the first of many I would have to confront. The cabin hummed with the soft drone of engines, punctuated by the occasional clink of glasses and the shuffle of attendants making their rounds. Eleanor settled into the window seat with deliberate ease, the faint curl of her smile betraying a satisfaction she seemed to carry like armor. She signaled the flight attendant by name, her voice smooth, commanding, every word calculated. I slid into the aisle seat, keeping my posture neutral, eyes tracking her gestures. The subtle way she manipulated the cabin made the flight her own little stage. A chill ran down my spine when she leaned slightly, tilting her head, and remarked casually that I was no longer included in the will. The words landed with a soft, surgical precision, cutting through my focus for a heartbeat. The envelope of documents I had glanced at earlier resurfaced in my mind, and I understood in that moment that this was not carelessness, nor oversight. Eleanor had combed through medical evaluations, psychological assessments, every record she could access, shaping them into justification for my exclusion, a legal shield masquerading as civility. I clenched my hands, feeling the weight of awareness pressing down, reminding me that patience and restraint had carried me only so far. I turned my attention to the cabin, scanning the muted movements of passengers, listening to the subtle creaks and hums of the fuselage, noting the faint chemical scent in the air. Every detail became a thread I could grasp, a way to anchor myself as the tension coiled tighter. The hum of the engines carried information, the vibration pattern, the subtle irregularity in pitch, and I absorbed it without panic, cataloging the potential threats, weighing every fraction of a second. A small girl whimpered in the row ahead, and a man in a Denver Nuggets hoodie clutched her hand like it might keep them tethered to safety. Eleanor's smirk lingered at the edge of my awareness, a reminder of the manipulation and control she thrived on. But beneath the surface, a new understanding had taken root. This flight was no longer just a journey home, it was a crucible. My endurance, my attention, my judgment, all of it, would be tested far beyond the quiet battles of family gatherings or legal maneuvering. By the time the first uneven lurch of the plane stirred unease through the cabin, I had made a silent vow to myself. The familiar order Eleanor had imposed, both in the family and in these small, controlled moments, was shifting. And I, for the first time in a long while, was preparing not just to observe, but to act. The stakes were rising, and I could feel that the confrontation awaiting me was no longer a matter of patience. It was a matter of survival. The cabin had shifted from quiet murmurs to a low, uneasy tension. The engines thrummed with a subtle irregularity that made the floorboards hum beneath my boots. A small girl 2 rows ahead clutched her mother's sleeve, tears tracking silently down her cheeks, while her father, wearing a Denver Nuggets hoodie, held her hand so tightly that his knuckles were white. I felt the weight of each movement, each anxious whisper, cataloging them alongside the vibration patterns through the fuselage. It was immediately clear that this was not ordinary turbulence. Something in the engines, the subtle pitch and resonance, spoke to a problem far more serious. Eleanor, oblivious to the real danger unfolding, maintained her poised composure, swirling her drink and tilting her head with a faint, calculated smirk. Her words, dripping with condescension, landed lightly, almost a jest, questioning whether I truly belonged on a commercial flight. But she had no inkling that the stakes had already escalated beyond any game she had orchestrated. My pulse settled into a measured rhythm. Every observation I made became a tool, every detail a signal of the severity that others hadn't yet recognized. I moved deliberately toward the cockpit, boots soft against the aisle carpet, eyes scanning the panel as I approached. Stokes, the co-pilot, pressed against the sidewall, one hand trembling over the controls. Lights flashed intermittently, casting sharp shadows across the cabin, while the faint acrid smell of overheated wiring began to seep in. Passengers gasped and murmured nervously, and a sudden jolt sent drinks sloshing across trays. Every second stretched, heavy with the knowledge that hesitation could cost lives. I weighed my options, recognizing the unspoken imperative: intervene or risk catastrophe. By the time my hand rested on the cockpit door, the decision crystallized. I was stepping into the unknown, and the cabin's 300 lives would pivot on my next movements. Eleanor's smirk faltered as the first sliver of realization crossed her face. She still could not measure the depth of what was coming. The door swung open, and I crossed the threshold. In that instant, the flight was no longer just a journey between cities. It had become a test of judgment, endurance, and decisive action, and I was no longer an observer. Inside the cockpit, Stokes flinched at my presence, but I offered a nod that carried both assurance and command. I clipped into the harness, drew in a deep, steadying breath, and assessed the controls, the engine readouts, the subtle irregularities that had been gnawing at my instincts. Every adjustment I considered, every manual calibration, was weighted against the knowledge that one misstep could send us plummeting. Eleanor's eyes widened behind the curtain, realization dawning that control was slipping from her grasp in a way she had never anticipated. The moment demanded full focus, and I could not allow any distraction, not even the ghost of familial power, to sway the next action I took. I set my jaw, adjusted the throttle, and took hold of the yoke. There was no room for doubt. The glide, the descent, and the 1,000 calculations I had rehearsed in simulation and experience were about to meet reality. The cabin's tension was palpable, passengers frozen in anticipation, the engines warning, the lights flickering, and for the first time, Eleanor could only watch. My choice was made, I would not wait. The cockpit became my domain, and the first true test of life or death had begun. Boots planted, Eyes fixed on instruments, hands steady. I engaged the sequence of maneuvers that would define the next minutes. The weight of 300 lives pressed invisibly against my shoulders. The hum of the engines sharp against the silence of awareness. Every movement, deliberate and exact, edged us closer to survival. And as the first corrective adjustments took effect, the cabin and Eleanor became witnesses to a command they had never anticipated. Survival was no longer theoretical. It was imminent, and the balance of control had irrevocably shifted. The runway appeared on the horizon like a fragile line through a gray sea, too short, too narrow, and the wind assaulted the plane from the north with an unrelenting insistence. Every vibration of the fuselage rattled through the cabin, sending murmurs of panic from passengers whose hands gripped armrests like lifelines. A child whimpered beside her mother, and a man ahead tightened his hold on his daughter so fiercely that the knuckles gleamed white. The red warning lights flickered across the panels, faint, acrid smoke curling from overheated circuits, and the cabin seemed to shake with every pulse of the engines. Each moment stretched impossibly long, each second a delicate calculation between survival and catastrophe. I felt it in my bones. Every misjudgment here would be irreversible. Eleanor's composure cracked for the first time. Her attempt to assert authority, shouting at attendants or gesturing sharply, fell flat. No one followed her commands, and the small grip she had over the cabin evaporated in the heat of imminent danger. I recognized the subtle shift instantly. She had always measured control by appearances, but the reality before her eyes could not be bent to fit her will. My focus narrowed. Glide mode, trim, flaps. Every adjustment was deliberate, precise, executed without hesitation. The engines needed to operate at minimal output. The plane danced violently in the wind, and the cabin held its collective breath. I scanned the faces around me, each expression a thread I could read. No longer just data, but the human weight pressing down with a raw immediacy. Stokes was tense beside me, hands trembling over switches, glancing at the gauges and seeking affirmation in my movements. I had to manage the aircraft and the crew simultaneously, a balancing act where a single lapse meant disaster. I kept my attention absolute. Every micro-adjustment, a negotiation with gravity, wind, and the limits of machinery. The passengers' anxious whispers, soft prayers, and gripping of loved ones became part of the rhythm I had to synchronize with, guiding the plane into a controlled path. Minutes blurred, but each one mattered. The glide stabilized incrementally, the violent shudders quieting under careful input, and the cabin gradually ceased its cacophony, the tension condensing into a thick, expectant silence. Eleanor's eyes tracked my hands, her earlier confidence replaced by a stark realization. She could no longer influence outcomes here. I held the yoke, tracing the final vectors toward the runway with unyielding attention, and the plane responded to each decision as if obeying instinct itself. Then the landing began. The wheels touched, the tail slammed down, and the air shifted with the screech of reverse thrust. The plane slowed, almost impossibly, just shy of the runway's edge. Silence held the cabin for a heartbeat before it cracked into a roar of exhalations, tears, and applause. I lowered the throttle, assessing the aircraft, the people, and Eleanor. For the first time, she saw clearly the extent of the strength she had underestimated. She could watch, but she could not touch. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, but I said nothing, did nothing to humiliate. I let the truth of competence speak for itself, a quiet reversal heavier than any words or gestures could convey. As the passengers began to gather themselves, clutching hands, brushing tears, I realized the opportunity the moment had created. Control was no longer just about the flight or the plane. It was about reclaiming agency, about building a path forward from chaos. The runway behind us was only the start. Ahead lay a reckoning and a chance to turn survival into something enduring. The storm had passed, but the balance of power had been rewritten, and I knew precisely how to follow through. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the laptop and the occasional shuffle of papers, but every detail demanded my attention. I opened the estate files, cross-referencing logs, internal emails, and shell companies Eleanor had quietly set up. Each page revealed another layer of manipulation, signatures that didn't match, documents altered to erase my stake and reshape the estate in her favor. It wasn't careless oversight. This was methodical, intentional, a calculated erasure of my place in what should have been my inheritance. The weight of it pressed down on me, but instead of panic, a focused clarity took hold. I began compiling the evidence, printing copies, backing up digital files, and creating a comprehensive report for the authorities. Every step had to be precise, each record highlighted, annotated, catalogued. Eleanor could discover my work at any moment. She thrived on control, and time was a scarce resource. Then, a metadata trace caught my eye, an IP address tied directly to her office, an unintentional breadcrumb proving her direct involvement. My pulse steadied. For once, the hidden truth was tangible and undeniable. I reviewed every email and log again, checking for overlooked gaps or plausible deniability, highlighting and annotating each irregularity. Satisfaction rippled through me, subtle but undeniable, not from triumph, but from knowing the scales of fairness were tilting back. The injustice of her actions was exposed in black and white, ready to be presented. But I held back any celebratory thought. By the time I closed the final tab and looked out the window at the pale Vermont sky, I made a decision. I would submit the evidence. Eleanor's control over the estate would end, and I could finally reclaim agency over what had been taken. The fight that had been quiet, strategic, and invisible for so long was about to manifest. Not in anger or retaliation, but through deliberate, unassailable action. What she thought was her dominance was about to shift, and the path forward would be mine to define. The temporary office at Windflight Institute spread wide and open before me, the scent of fresh paint mingling with the faint tang of fuel from the training aircraft parked just outside. Cadets shuffled through the simulator bays, their eyes wide with anticipation and nerves, unaware of the storm of family betrayal that had brought me here. I sat at the long table, sorting the files, attachments, and affidavits one last time before sending them to the authorities and my attorney. Every shell company, email thread, and access log was meticulously catalogued, each piece a testament to the manipulation that had been hidden in plain sight for years. I hit send and leaned back, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle. Eleanor might have realized what I was doing, but the timing was precise, and the evidence irrefutable. There would be no escape, no opportunity for her to rewrite the narrative she had tried to control for so long. A deep sense of calm washed over me. The legal channels would now uphold the truth. Within days, confirmation arrived. The authorities validated the extent of her interference and manipulation. My rights and stake in the estate were fully restored. Eleanor was stripped of her influence, unable to wield power or interfere further. The shift was quiet, procedural, but it carried a weight far beyond the documents. I allowed myself a brief exhale, knowing the battle for fairness had been won without theatrics or confrontation. Turning to the work ahead, I refocused on the institute. Cadets streamed past, eager and uncertain, and among them was Morgan Vinn, Eleanor's daughter. I observed her with a critical eye, enforcing discipline and fairness in every instruction, setting a standard of expectation rather than legacy. As I guided her through maneuvers, I felt a satisfaction that was not rooted in vengeance, but in action and empowerment. The flight, the calculations, the legal battles, they had all converged here, in this space, shaping a future that was now tangible and just. Morgan lifted off for her first solo circuit, her confidence shaky but real, and I knew that the long and brutal journey I had endured had created a foundation for the next generation to rise beyond the limits imposed on them. The night air over the New Mexico desert was crisp, carrying the faint hum of engines as cadets rotated through the simulators and practiced circuits along the moonlit runway. I watched intently, correcting crosswind landings, adjusting flaps, guiding hands and eyes through every technical nuance. Each cadet's progress was a reflection not just of skill, but of resilience, focus, and the lessons that could only come from facing challenges head-on. The first to take off was Morgan Vinn, Eleanor's daughter, her movements tentative yet determined, a living testament to a legacy being reshaped for the better. I held the worn patch from my own flight suit in my palm, frayed edges reminding me of battles endured, decisions made under pressure, and moments where every second carried life or death. That small emblem carried the weight of survival, perseverance, and the lessons I had earned, grounding me as I observed the next generation. Looking back on the journey, the 300 lives saved in a cabin shaken by chaos, the estate restored, the battles fought quietly against manipulation and betrayal, I understood something essential. True victory does not require tearing another down. It lies in reclaiming agency, in creating spaces where others can rise beyond imposed limits, and in knowing that the work done leaves a mark far deeper than any spectacle of revenge. The cadets lifted into the night sky, each ascent a symbol of freedom, empowerment, and the lasting impact of deliberate action. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, powerless to intervene, and I felt the satisfaction of a different kind of triumph, one defined by integrity, endurance, and the quiet establishment of a legacy that would outlive all grudges. The victory was mine, not through confrontation, but through the lives shaped, the paths cleared, and the empowerment I had forged from the trials endured.